As a group, we found the weeks on forced labour particularly engaging due to contemporary resurgence today and the fact that racial discrimination is still rife in the world we live in. It is therefore something that needs to be tackled head on. Not only this, but the forced labour work allowed us to look into past histories, which we saw as vital for us as a society to progress in the future. The topic of slavery is also prevalent for geography as a subject due to its fundamental link and is thus important to reflect upon. By moving away from our colonial past into a more considered and encompassing world that takes into account racial subjugation that took place in the slave trade, enables us to learn from our past and create a future that does not disregard history, but positions it in a light that it can be viewed appropriately and challenged to meet our present-day thoughts on the matter. Another historical figure which grabbed our attention was the role of John Pinney, a merchant who owned slave-based sugar plantations on the island of Nevis. It highlighted the significant role which Bristol had had in the slave trade and the extent to which much of the wealth of the city originated through slave-based trade. Moreover, the module has therefore allowed us to ask questions about Bristol's historical geographies that highlighted its inextricable link to the transatlantic slave trade and posed a new question of how this is still present today in Bristol. As a group, we found the Bristol philanthropist and 17th century slave trader Edward Colston remarkably important in Bristol's history due to his continual legacy that still shadows Bristol as a city. This module has encouraged us to rethink previous assumptions that Britain has moved away from its dark colonial past, and we wish to explore this further through our research question.
Now I will focus on the inspiration process we went through in order to formulate our opinions and research. There has been a resurgence regarding the slave trade in the summer of 2020, and this occurs following the Black Lives Matter movement. During a protest for this cause, a statue of Edward Colston was torn down and thrown into a river as he was involved in the slave trade. There are still many traces of slavery that exist in Bristol today, such as street names, school names, and concert names. With a 150-year-old hall ditching its name shed with a 17th century slave trader. There has also been an increased interest in the media, with the Telegraph in 2017 highlighting concerns of purging the city of the slave trader. And this contrasted to Robert Mendick, who stated that it's political correctness gone mad. A recent art installation was formed at the foot of the Edwin Colston statue in the formation of slaves lying in a ship. This can be linked to the so-called modern slavery with jobs such as fruit workers, sex workers, and kitchen workers. The reason we settled on this topic was due to the belief that we need to tackle and challenge our historical geographies and progress away from our colonial past. With such clear links to imperialism or colonialism in geography, it is important to provide attention to important topics such as slavery, which were previously ignored.
Following on from our inspiration process, we began to see the direction of our research question taking form. Through our enjoyment in the weeks focused on forced labour, we began researching into the slave trade and how this period is reflected in Bristol's history today. Our research question aimed to follow Bristol's history from its colonial past up into the present day with the toppling of Colston's statue in the summer of 2020. With this aim, it allowed us to touch upon the ideas of forced labour surrounding the slave trade, causing us to examine the architecture and the naming of streets as an anchor to reflect how Bristol's relationship with work is tied up in forced labour. The work of Dresser 2016 provided a great insight into the magnitude of Bristol's role in the transatlantic slave trade, stating that it was once the nation's #1 slave import. As a result, this solidified our interest in Bristol's relationship with forced labour and caused us to create our research question around this topic. Our focus concentrated on Colston's statue as it enabled us to investigate the past, yet provided contemporary views on forced labour in the present day after its toppling, thus causing us to see the statue as a case study for our research. This case study would be used in conjunction with previous changes to the city's commemoration of other slave owners, like that of John Pinney and his contemporary reflection through the Georgian House Museum, to give a wider breadth of scope into Bristol's past. Consequently, we identified a turning point in the process of Bristolians, which demonstrated how perhaps they may be continued to movement to a transition away from Bristol's dark past into a new 21st century city. However, there are multiple stances as to whether this change would be positive for Bristol, and this interested us to why many individuals were opposing a move away from memorialising the slave trade. As a result, this led us to settle on the research question of how has forced labour regarding the slave trade shaped and continued to shape Bristol as a city?
Finding papers which have been relevant and reflect our research question have been key to helping us understand how forced labour has shaped present-day Bristol. For example, GEO1313 writes about the importance of imperialism which has shaped the discipline of geography and how it has encouraged imperialist projects surrounding the infrastructure of Bristol. Furthermore, visiting the area of the statue and interviewing the public through random selection would help us understand people's thoughts and feelings towards the toppling of Colston's statue. Some areas would include Colston's Hall, streets, and pubs with names that are linked to the slave trade, and Perry's Bridge, which we would have to visit. Interviewing people through random selection will help us have an understanding of the general public's views and feelings towards the toppling of the statue, and the opinions of certain individuals may differ and vary. In order to further develop this method, conducting an interview with two individuals who have opposing views towards the toppling of the statue would highlight the contradictions between the arguments surrounding forced labour and slave trade, as we would have to ask the individuals how they balance their views surrounding slavery and its association with the development of Bristol as a city. In addition, finding out the reason of the commission of the statue regarding the Merchants Association would be very helpful in looking at how it differs from the development plans Bristol has set in place in the present day. As a result, this would allow us to reflect back onto our research questions to figure out how Bristol will further be shaped by the attitudes, thoughts, and actions of the general public. Each step that we took in our methodology allowed us to have a better understanding of how Bristol's past in forced labour and slavery continues to shape the city and its infrastructure. Looking at the city's involvement in the BLM protest could also be a very good indicator of how Bristol views progress in the development past forced labour and slavery. This would further highlight the position and stance of the general public, which would in turn indicate how Bristol will continue to be shaped by its past in the promotion of slavery and forced labour.
The materials that we thought would be most adequate in answering our question, how has forced labour in regards to the slave trade shaped and continues to shape Bristol as a city, were interviews and historical records. By carefully selecting a range of materials that help us understand both the past and the present, it would provide us with the opportunity to answer the question most accurately. The advantages of using interviews are that they would give us the most all-rounded contemporary understanding of Bristol today and the range of opinions and feelings towards the statue. Alongside interviews, historical records would provide an insight into the way in which Bristol was shaped and the identity that came with it.
Through the content provided and our individual rabbit holes we explored, this module has equipped us with more knowledge about Bristol's part in the slave trade, which has been a topic of contemporary discussion with the emphasis on racial discrimination today. For a city that is fundamentally built on slave labour, Bristol is a part of this debate around the decolonialisation of place through questioning the moral and political correctness of statues, roads and public buildings associated with the names of slave traders. As our research question suggests, Bristol has been shaped by slavery, and it is now the responsibility of modern society to question how slavery continues to shape the city. If we were to improve the methodology for our research question, we would look at further examples of cities like Bristol that were also rooted in colonial pasts, as well as other public colonial statues. Also, to be aware of current forms of media memory instead of physical forms of remembrance, such as statues. Through understanding these colonial pasts, it helps to undo the wrong that was done centuries ago and the hate that has continued to perpetuate since then. In the example of Colston's statue, for example, whether we keep it up or take it down, we must remember the place that forced labour had in Bristol's history so that Bristol's future can be improved.